Hi, Prose and Pine friends. Today, I am going to talk to you a little bit about fantasy books. So a question that we get all the time from folks is, what kind of fantasy book am I going to like? There's a lot of folks who are getting interested in fantasy, already interested in fantasy, but want to dig in deeper and aren't sure where to get started. So I'm going to teach you kind of two things. So I'm going to talk to you about two things about fantasy worlds and fantasy books that's going to help you understand what kind of fantasy you're going to like, what you're going to read, what you're going to be in the mood for. And I'm going to do it by sharing some books from my personal collection. So the first thing that you want to know when it comes to fantasy is whether something is high fantasy or low fantasy. Low fantasy books are books that take place on Earth or a world very similar to Earth, but there's magic there. We don't necessarily need to know how. We don't need to know why. We just need to know that magic exists. Y'all can probably think of one of the most popular low fantasy books, Harry Potter. Takes place in London. You don't go to a whole new planet. You don't go to a whole different galaxy to read Harry Potter. You stay right in London, but there's a whole mystical, magical world that us muggles know nothing about. Harry Potter is an example of low fantasy. There's a few other low fantasy books that I just read that I absolutely loved. One is The Bewitching, and that is kind of a dark fantasy that takes place over 3 different timelines: a grandmother's timeline, a granddaughter's timeline, and then a mystical disappearance that the granddaughter is exploring. Takes place partially in Mexico, partially in the US. It's low fantasy, takes place in the US and Mexico and this world, but there's magic. Another example is Hemlock and Silver. Hemlock and Silver is one of my favorite books so far this year. The Bewitching is another one of my favorite books so far this year. Hemlock and Silver is a modern retelling of Snow White. It's kind of a twisted fairy tale, dark fantasy. Doesn't explicitly say it's in this planet, but when you read about it, it's very similar to this planet. There are places with deserts and other places there are castles. I don't know that it technically is in this planet, but overall it is very similar to planet Earth. Now let's talk a little bit about high fantasy. Whenever you read something with high fantasy, one of the things that you're going to notice is that most books are going to have a map in them because the world is not Earth and the world is very different than Earth. Mistborn is a great example of high fantasy. Brandon Sanderson is a great author. He's written several fantasy books, and he kind of specializes in high fantasy, hard magical systems, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Mistborn is a really accessible read because even though it's not Earth, there's a lot of similarities to Earth. There are some monsters and other figures, but there are also a lot of humans, and there's a lot of overlap with planet Earth. So if you want something that's not totally different, where your brain doesn't have to do too much shifting, Mistborn is a great high fantasy, kind of intro to high fantasy option. Throne of Glass is another example of high fantasy. This is a book that does not take place on Earth. There's fae, there's humans, there's monsters from different portals. All of it is in this book. Fourth Wing, another example of high fantasy. This takes place in a world that's totally different from planet Earth, completely different world. You get all the maps, you get all the fun stuff. And probably one of the books that's high fantasy that's completely different from fantasy or from planet Earth is Way of Kings from the Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson. In this world, there are these things called high storms that roll through every so often. You can't survive a high storm. And so the entire world is attuned to the high storm. So there's a lot of like crustaceans, and the world is made of shells, and there isn't grass. Like one of the characters finds a place with grass and they're enthralled because they're like, what is this thing that moves? Plants aren't supposed to move. There's also crustacean people and figures and gods, and it takes place on an entirely different cosmological system called the Cosmere. If you're into the Marvel universe, you're gonna probably be really into Sarah J. Maas and Brandon Sanderson because they have essentially created the reader version of that. So this is an example of high fantasy. I personally find that low fantasy is more accessible in terms of I can pick it up, I can read it for 5 minutes, I can put it back down. If I'm reading high fantasy, I'm generally wanting to read for at least 30 minutes because it takes my brain time to mentally shift to a whole new world and understand that world and appreciate that world. And so it's harder for me to pick up a high fantasy book for like 5 minutes at a time. You might be different, that's just my experience. Now we're going to talk a little bit about magical systems. So there are different kinds of magical systems. Everything exists on a spectrum, y'all. So when we talk about magical systems, what we mean is, are there hard and fast rules, or is it more vibes, no rules kind of magic? If you think about Harry Potter, we start off with some general kind of rules, abracadabra. I know that's not in Harry Potter, y'all. I've read this so many times. Wingardium Leviosa, right? Like there's specific spells, but then all of a sudden there's all these rules that don't make sense, and there are time turners, and sometimes you can use them and sometimes you can't, and there's no rhyme or reason why. And it's all vibes, no rules. So Harry Potter is a great example of a soft magical system, which means it's more like magic exists. We don't necessarily need to know how it exists. There's not always rhyme or reason as to why things happen the way they happen. They just do. Oh, that's not soft magical system. Another example of a soft magical system, in my opinion, would be Throne of Glass. There's magic. Sometimes everyone can heal. Sometimes no one can heal. Sometimes there's fire. Sometimes there's other things. And there's not really a lot of like firm explanations as to who can do what and why those things matter. There are some rules to it, but I would say the rules are pretty fast and loose. And it's not necessarily like when you're reading this, you're not like, that character can't do that. All of a sudden I'm like, oh, they're healing that person. I guess they can do that. All right, cool. Another example of a soft magical system in terms of TV shows is Sabrina the Teenage Witch, one of my all-time favorite TV shows. Sabrina the Teenage Witch has no internal consistency. There are no rules. It's magic and we love it. We don't need to know how it works. We just need to know it works. On the other hand, you might be a fan of hard magical systems. In hard magical systems, there are rules and the world and the magic follow the rules. So, for example, in Fourth Wing, healers use tinctures and potions and things like that. Menders can mend. Only people that are attached to dragons can have special powers. Menders can only restore things to their original state. So Violet cannot basically be cured of her hyperextension, hypermobility, Ehlers-Danlos, because that's how she was born. And so that is kind of a hard magical rule, that you can't just have her suddenly be healed past where she was, because the rule of the magic is that this is how mending works, and you can mend it to this point. The fun thing about hard magical systems is that if you keep track of the rules, you can kind of tell what is and isn't possible and how characters may or may not get out of situations, because you'll say they can't do that. They'll never be able to leave that way, and they can't, and the author has to figure something else out. One of the people who does the hardest magical systems is Brandon Sanderson. He spends pages and pages and pages developing internal consistency. And so when you read Mistborn, for instance, essentially there are people with magical powers, and when they ingest certain metals, they can use those metals, burn those metals to basically have magical powers. Certain people can burn certain metals, some people can burn all of the metals, but it's very, very internally consistent. And there are pages spent on this. During the book, someone is mentoring a young girl on how to use her magic, and he's telling her, here's what you can do and can't do. But at the same time, what Brandon Sanderson is telling you is, here's what these characters can do and can't do. And Brandon Sanderson has a rule in his books that characters cannot get out of situations with new magic. They can get into bad situations with new magic, but nothing can magically happen that helps them escape a situation. So Brandon Sanderson has one of the hardest of hard magical systems. The fun thing about these books is that if you read them, you can kind of figure out what's happening. In Mistborn, there's a whole scene where I was like, this thing is happening. I know what that's related to, so this thing has to be happening. When would that have happened? And so the fun thing about hard magical systems is that you can kind of tell what's going on and how things are happening. But sometimes we just want magic and we want it to be fun and we want it to be vibes, and that's okay too. So those are the two big things I would say to consider when you're wanting to read a fantasy book and when you're trying to decide what kind of fantasy you like. Do you like something similar to Earth that just has magic? Or do you like something that's totally different to Earth where you're going to be transported to a different planet? And do you want vibes and magic all over and it doesn't matter? Or do you want something that's really internally consistent where there are rules and you understand them and you're kind of solving that piece of the puzzle? Those two things are going to help you pick when you decide on what kind of fantasy books that you're reading. Hard fantasy, things like Brandon Sanderson, Hemlock and Silver, I would say is another kind of hard magical system in that the main character is exploring what can and can't be done. Soft magical systems, low fantasy, and high fantasy. I hope this was helpful. I'm really curious what kind of fantasy y'all like, what you're into. I would love to hear. I love all of it, but I love all of it at different points in time. Love to hear your thoughts, what kind of fantasy you like. What's your favorite fantasy book? Tell me, I want to know. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye, friends.